Kate Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book, and we are continuing our coverage of Glimpses of Other Realities, Volume 2, High Strangeness, by Moulton Howe. This is video number 3. And if you want to start at the beginning of the book, last Saturday we did videos 1 and 2. This is number 3. And I'm going to just jump right into it to try to get as much covered as we possibly can today. We ended with the Men in Black concept, witnesses of these strange events, UFO sightings, ET sightings, claims of abduction, crop circles. Just anybody who spoke out publicly would get a little visit from these very odd men in black, and they were threatened. And people want to know, was this agents of the government, or were these also these unexplained entities? So video number 3 starts with nuclear missiles disabled at Moulton Air Force Base, March 16th, 1967. So I just want to show you, this book is full of documentation, and this is a copy of a newspaper article. You can read the book. But my point here is just that, yes, it's possible to falsify information. Tons of misinformation out there in the world. And I noticed one of my last videos, YouTube felt it was necessary to explain what UFO and alien stuff was. So let me make it clear for the purposes of YouTube from the very beginning that this is a book written about phenomena that are increasingly becoming more mainstream, but when the book was written and previous to it were a subject of enormous debate and skepticism. It is a controversy. It is a debate. There are a number of different opinions about this. This is one person's collation of documentation, and it's extremely well documented book. Almost half of it is appendices, and lots of references to newspaper articles that were published, and you can go back in the archives of the newspapers. So just to make this really clear, this is by Moulton Howe. This is her collation of information, evidence that she gathered over time, her report of eyewitnesses who have come to her and spoken with her, and she put it on the record, and I'm simply presenting it to you. I am not pushing any one particular viewpoint. I certainly have my opinions, but that's not for here. Right now we're just covering Moulton Howe's collection of evidence. And you saw the photocopy of the newspaper article. And in 1996, she was sent this newspaper article from Montana. And it was sent to her by an interested party who said, hey, this happened. And what the article is about is excuse me, UFOs flying over missile silos. So the guy that sent her the article agreed to do a radio interview. So this has been publicized on the airwaves. And his name is Salas, is his last name. And in 1967, he said, and this is a synopsis of his own words that were from a transcript of a radio show. He says, I was the first lieutenant at Moulton Air Force Base. My job was I monitored and prepared the launch of Minuteman missiles. I was supposed to monitor them and report incursions, and I did maintenance on them and prepared the launch, should they be launched. God forbid, that's me, not him. March 16th in 1967, I was on duty. He was the commander of the November flight lecture. This, I'm sorry, he wasn't the commander. This was called a November flight lecture, and the commander was taking a nap. They would alternate time periods of work and rest. They did 12-hour shifts, broken up with naps. They did a total of a 24-hour shift, and they broke them up into sections. Early in the morning, now mind you, they're 80 feet roughly below ground in these facilities at what's called Launch Control Center. And early in the morning, he got a call from a security guard that was on surface who said that the security guard and other people on the surface were seeing UFOs flying over the facility. And of course, that their job was to report this to this guy who was in charge of monitoring. And what they saw was bright flashing lights. Now, UFO has a lot of weight to it in popular culture, but they're using the appropriate technical definition, unidentified flying objects. Something's up there, we don't know what. And this was bright flashing lights that were traveling at speed, in other words, going really fast, and doing maneuvers that were not possible for any known Air Force plane to be doing. The guard called back 15 minutes later and was really stressed out and said, hey, one of these things is hovering outside the front gate. It's silent. It had been moving at alarming speed. Suddenly it's just hovering. Can't do that, with the Newtonian physics. It's glowing kind of a red, and it looks like a saucer. So Solace, the guy down below, 80 feet below, felt freaked out. He said because the guards were so weirded out. This wasn't like the guards to react this way. So the guard said he suddenly had to go because one of the other guards had gotten hurt. And later on, what they discovered was the hurt occurred when the second guard approached the UFO. He had to be helicoptered off to a medical facility. So, according to this guy on the radio, talking to Linda Moulton Howe, who was down below, they weren't able to find the above ground guards to follow up this eyewitness stuff. And he says this is one reason why he agreed to do the radio program interview. He was hoping that a guard would hear it, a former guard would hear it and speak out. So he wasn't allowed to leave. He's on duty, and somebody has to be monitoring these nuclear missiles. And so he had to sit there. He went and woke up his commander and woke up the commander. And while he was telling him about what was going on, everything shut down. All the bells and lights and whistles that were an alarm went off, and all the missiles shut down. They went totally off alert status. They could not be launched if they needed to be launched. And he said this happened to between 5 and 10 different missiles. And he said to even have one stop working was, I lost my earring, was highly, highly, highly unusual. He said, I had no idea how almost 10 of them went down. So it was worse than just like an electronic glitch. These things couldn't be launched. This is really, really serious. So they've, of course, put 2 and 2 together and got UFO. I mean, what's different? Why is this suddenly happening? Well, there's this saucer hanging over. Now, these are military people. These are Air Force people who reported on this. This is not, Anyway, as soon as all the missiles shut down, the UFO left. And so they followed protocol. They reported this to the main base. The maintenance crews came. They sent out security patrols. And all these people that were called in to do fixing, guarding, etc., all later officially reported they saw more of the same. Another launch facility reported all 10 of their missiles shut down. This was at Echo Flight, a facility 10 miles down the road from this original story. So he later requested Freedom of Information Act documents, and he only got them for the second incident, the Echo flight. There were no documents available for what he had experienced. So on the day this happened, after his shift, he asked the guard, he said, "Look me in the eye." The guard that was above ground. He says, "Look me in the eye. Are you telling me the absolute truth? There was a saucer-shaped UFO hovering over these missile silos?" And the guard answered him, and he said the guard was terrified. The guard said, yeah. He was struck. Salas was struck by the level of fear. So he says the system's not designed for an event like this. It's very rare to lose even one missile off of alert status, and never had this happened before. If one failed, it would not logically affect the others. They were independent of each other. So the system's designed to prevent all of them going out all at the same time. This is a disaster potentially. So the Air Force brought in experts, and they studied, electrical people and technical people. They could not explain what had happened. They brought in Boeing engineers, and they said, we don't know. They just could not determine. So he has the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act documents of a telegram from the Air Force to Boeing asking for help. And the Air Force is telling Boeing there's a cause for grave concern to this headquarters. So Howe asks him, on the record, the Air Force says there were no UFO incidents that have ever impacted U.S. national security. They made this official statement in 1969, Howe says. And his answer is that's absolutely false. This is allegedly, this is a quote, me quoting a radio interview. This is what the guy told Linda Moulton Howe. He said it was classified, and we could not talk, and we did not talk, but it happened. In the 90s, it was declassified, and he encouraged others who were there to please come forward. He said all the guards, all the maintenance crew, anybody involved that day at the facility saw this happen. So she asks him, why did the Air Force cover it up? And he said that under the FOIA documents, he said, I discovered that there was an earlier incident at Alpha Flight, December of 1966, where the missiles shut down. 1966. He said they weren't debriefed at any time ever, which is completely foreign to protocol. And the next morning, he went and told his squadron commander about this. And he said that the commander, and this is different than the guy that was down below ground with him. He told the squadron commander, and he said that the commander was absolutely shocked because his crews were never told what or why by the Air Force. He says, Salas says that the government didn't know what it was, or they did know and they were covering it up. But in either case, they were covering it up. Howe says, were more missiles? There were more missiles that were interrupted along the northern border, U.S.-Canada border, and 66, 67, 75, these have all been reported. And the government must have known that some kind of thing, UFO, had the ability to interfere and intrude our airspace, and even were capable of changing the codes and stuff on these missiles to shut them down. I mean, it interfered with secret codes that ran these things. And this contradicts their denial that there was any threat to national security. Howe says she believes that the UFO was trying to save us by trying to save themselves, but us too, by preventing us from destroying ourselves and the earth. And he says the government has tried to get rid of nukes globally. They have attempted to do that, as though they knew maybe we need to not have these things. So then they discuss a close encounter in Cambodia in 1971. I remember what's going on in Southeast Asia at the time. allegedly, the report is, now this is all allegedly, I'm just going to reiterate this throughout this video. I don't want to get in trouble with YouTube, but all of this is allegations. All of this has a certain amount of documentation. I'm not arguing pro or con. I'm simply reporting on what the book is reporting on. So allegedly, according to the book and according to documents she presents in the book, the government has known about all of this since at least Truman. In the 50s, they tried to shoot UFOs down, and there were retrievals, and they were hidden and lied about. Leonard Stringfield is a U.S. Air Force vet and a UFO researcher. He says no one will ever know how many American pilots died in these efforts, but it's a non-zero number. So did this provoke more ET interest in us because we were being aggressive? Peter Bostrom, a Vietnam vet, the one who makes the archaeological molds we talked about last week, is also an expert photographer. And in 1990, he gave Howe a document of a conversation of a military encounter with gray-skinned ETs, and tells about a close encounter during the Vietnam War, this document. There were many eyewitnesses in this place at this time of discs and gray aliens, and the question that they put forward in the book is, were aliens helping the U.S. government, and were they using the war as a way to hide, cover up their sample taking? So this story is of a violent interaction between a GI and an ET, and it shows that the human violence involved, the alien restraint involved, and U.S. intelligence's aggressive intimidation of witnesses subsequently. So Peter Bostrom, this is the archaeological guy. This is his introduction. He said, I videotaped a conversation in the mid-'80s with permission of a Special Forces guy who was retired, who he calls Joe, it's anonymous, who served in Thailand in Vietnam. He was special training in electronics. And at the time of the conversation, Joe ran an electronic repair thing in the Midwest. So he had retired and moved to the Midwest. But in 1971, in Cambodia, it was out of bounds. If you remember the whole Nixon Cambodia bombing, blah, 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 right? So MJ-12, the Majestic 12 secret investigative group, they were a government entity, and they were getting information about UFOs. So Joe, the electronics guy, told Bostrom, the archaeology guy, that he was contacted by an official friend who still is in the military. And it was okay to speak freely about, he was told, about ET encounters in Cambodia. And this guy, the friend, talking to Joe, active military friend, told him that this information will be made public in the near future anyway. So I've been given permission to talk. And the only caveat was he was told, don't say why you were in Cambodia. Okay. So the guy told Joe that Roswell did happen, that he described how those with the need to know are given access in such a high security situation, and then other people, nobody knows. He told him there are two types of gray alien that he knew about, and then that there are also Nordics. So this is the story of the GI's encounter in Cambodia in 71. Joe, the retired electronics guy, in September of 71, he was stationed with the army in Thailand. They made routine missions into Cambodia near Angkor Wat. They would search and destroy Pol Pot Khmer Rouge insurgents in the area. They went into the jungle. They heard a weird humming noise. This is this one day. And they thought, this must be an insurgent fueling station or something up ahead for their Russian-made helicopters. So they proceeded forward and got into a clearing. It was the guy Joe, and he was a lieutenant, and he was with 14 U.S. Special Forces guys and another 24 Thai soldier operatives, I'm not sure. So they were shocked to find there were no helicopters because they just assumed. But they had heard previous stories of some kind of flying thing. And what do you know? They see a spherical object on 4 legs surrounded by as many non-humanoids as his group totaled. So counting him, we have, what did I say, 38, 39, so almost 40, some sort of aliens. Okay, so he's not counting the Thai people. So he's saying that there were between 16 and 21 of these aliens. Or as he calls them, non-humanoids. And he said they looked like dwarves. They were gray. They were less than 5 feet tall. They were gray-white skinned. They wore silver jumpsuits like mylar with some type of instruments that they had. They didn't look like weapons. They looked like some kind of tool. He was accompanied by a young GI, and this was only his second time ever out in the jungle, and he freaked out, and he shot at these guys. And he says he was familiar at the time with bulletproof flak jackets, but that's all. And the bullet hit the ET dropped. One ET was taller. He was closer to 5'7", and he stepped up. He intervened. Joe freaked out. The ETs were going to kill them all with ray guns. He said all he could do was associate this with science fiction. He thought he was imagining things. This tall ET held up a hand to Joe in a peace gesture, went over and slapped the young GI shooter gently. That GI, the young guy, dropped like he had a shock. And Joe admits, he's not proud to say this, but he admits, I soiled myself. Literally. So all the rest of the GIs were seasoned vets, and they were holding back. So this guy that got shocked got up and recovered, and the alien who had been shot brushed himself off, got up, brushed himself off, and recovered. And Joe figured, oh, his suit looks weird. It must be bulletproof. Like I said, he was familiar with flak jackets. This wasn't that. But the guy didn't seem to be hurt by the bullet. The tall ET made the peace gesture again. Joe got sort of a telepathic message. Everything's cool. Everything's okay. The ETs packed up and silently left. They just retracted the legs of the ship. It lifted straight up, no noise, and shot out in an instantaneous burst of speed. It had a mirrored surface. It was tall as a 5-story building. It was round like a ball, and it had a symbol on it in black writing. And I want to show you the picture of this because this is the basic shape of the vehicle, and that's the symbol. This matches the UFO description of the New Mexico State Highway Patrol officer, Lonnie Zamora. And we've talked about this before. He was just driving along in the desert in New Mexico and saw a light off the road. And when he went to look at it, he found an alien ship and aliens. And, you know, people did not want to believe him. So this was in 1964. And he also drew exactly the same thing here. And what these people saw had no door, no window. It seemed impervious to small arm fire. So Howe says, well, that begs the question, did they shoot at it? How do they know? It had a high-pitched hum on the ground and a silent ascent. The military guys had to report this to the civilians who ID'd themselves as representatives of Magic MJ-12. So Joe returned to the base. The Thais, they said nothing. They were shook up and they said nothing. It's a 3-day return trip on foot across the border. And during that time, they all agreed, we saw nothing. We're going to say nothing. The guy who got slapped was a corporal. He was okay. So Joe was summoned to his captain's office. He's met by a captain and 2 majors, a colonel, and civilians that seemed to belong to, as he put it, the firm, the CIA. So was this some sort of CIA group that worked with military who was involved with MJ-12 and aliens? He said they seemed very overly concerned with enemy aircraft, unusual sightings, or events. They wanted any photos they may have taken. He said he was asked about if they took a photo, what was in the photo. They gave no information to him. He said they were very cold-blooded. They didn't even break into a sweat. And they were wearing dark suits in 100-degree weather, 110% humidity. He said it was so hot, the heat looked like a fog in the room. So he said he had a cold sweat going on. And they grilled him for 4 hours. They knew it had happened. They knew where the group was back. When they got back, they knew about their return in less than an hour of their return. Joe had not even had time to shower after his time in the jungle. The group of people who saw this were sequestered in quarters. Their meals were brought in. Nobody was talking to them. They were told not to talk to anybody. They were questioned by a variety of people for 3 weeks, including a psychologist who did ink blot tests on him. They were put under narco-hypnosis using psychic resistance drugs, which removed their memories. So even today, he doesn't know the truth of how bad the encounter was because his memory has been manipulated. And he said most of these people that he's still in contact with still have nightmares and flashes of some sort of a bloodbath. The young guy who was slapped was immediately reassigned. And 8 weeks later, Joe was called in to identify the guy's body who was slapped. And it was very decomposed. So he couldn't identify it. And he seemed that this cell, this is gross. He was kind of liquefied, that his cell walls were broken. So it took years of memory fragments coming to him for him to even start to want to talk about it. So he was having flashbacks. He remembers there was no door, but the aliens re-entered a section of this ship. It just sort of suddenly, part of it just slid down with an opening. And the thing that slid down kind of came out and formed a ramp. They went up. So every time he tries to remember, he says he has a panic attack and he has cold sweats and nightmares. Now, there were other incidents in Southeast Asia. There was a group of GIs pinned down. 2 aliens stepped out of the jungle through what he called a darkness grenade. In other words, the aliens did something and everything went black. And after that, they all reported this, and there was the same sort of weird debriefing and grilling and psychological tests, etc. And their uniforms were confiscated and taken for testing. Joe says this stuff was not of this earth. This was not American government or foreign government global foreign government global stuff. So then we get to the UFO sightings at Bentwaters Air Force Base in England, December 26 to 28, 1980. So we've talked about this before. We did the book, Left at East Gate by Pennington, I believe. This was a shared, side-by-side shared facility between the RAF and the U.S. Air Force. And it was surrounded by the Rendlesham Woods, but there was Bentwaters, and then I forget the name of the English, technically the English part of it had its own name. The American part of it had its own name. And then there's Rendlesham Forest. And this event, still confused, still not clear. And the guys involved in this also underwent narco-hypnosis. Oh, Woodbridge, I wrote it down. So I don't know which is which. One's American Air Force, one's RAF. Woodbridge, Bentwaters. And you'll hear it called the Rendlesham Forest incident because the base was surrounded by the Rendlesham Forest. So outside Bentwaters, RAF, Bentwaters, they saw odd lights in the forest. And two security guys, a guy called Peniston and a guy called Smith, and Smith is an alias, they encountered the light up close, and their memories were later wiped. And if you haven't seen the video I made, a couple of years ago, you should get the book, Left at East Gate. It is mind-boggling. So September of 94, Peniston underwent hypnosis as a civilian, and he did it to remember. And this is a summary of the transcript of the audio of that hypnosis session from 1994. So Peniston says he was having Christmas dinner on Christmas Day with his family, and then he returned to the base that night to go to work. And they saw a report, he was one of the guards, blue-red lights in the forest right beside the base near East Gate about 2 o'clock in the morning of the 26th. This is 1980. And afterwards, they did debriefings and meetings with superiors. And let me see here. What did I? Okay, I'm not going to read this transcript because it's really time consuming, and I don't want to get in trouble for reading an entire transcript word for word. But they recorded his session, and he signed a release. They used sodium pentothal. And he said he was happy to do it to get it off his back. He said that he went to, called in for like a debriefing. And they told him that they were going to put him under hypnosis. So now we're going to talk about the hypnosis that happened the day after the event. And he's reporting all of this under hypnosis a decade and a half later. And in both cases, they used medication to get him under. So he signed a government release to the military, and they gave him sodium pentothal, and he agreed to it because he just wanted to stop dealing with these interrogations. And the guy that put the needle in his arm for the drug told him, "Oh, we do this all the time. It's standard procedure." So under the pentothal, he told the government of the lights. He told them of the symbols they saw on the side of the UFO. They asked him, "Did you see this binary code?" And he said he saw it, and he told them what he saw. And he said that when he was going through the experience in the woods, looking at this binary code, in his brain, he was able to translate it. And it told him, by reading it, explain this mission. Our mission is contact with the people of the earth. We want to do research to help people on earth. We're from a very far place in the future. That's what this binary code told him. He was able to understand it. And he didn't know that until he went under. He was told, I guess by the aliens, I don't know, that they needed chromosomes from interpreters. And they didn't take his. The whole thing was interrupted when he reached out and touched the symbols, these binary code on the outside of this thing. And he activated them. And the ship was on the ground to repair itself from something. And that's why it was there to begin with. And when he touched it, he activated this binary code and it went into him. And the government men knew that they had a problem. They had to keep him quiet. The ETs told him that they were here to get chromosomes from people because in the future they had some sort of physical problem. The human race did. And they had been coming between 30 and 40,000 years. to sustain their children in the future. That their kids were hairless, pale, they had large eyes, and that was so that they could take in more light because the earth was different. And Peniston was told that this won't hurt, and that after all of this, would it alter our future? Didn't know. But without the chromosomes, they would die because they're not able to reproduce. So he was told there's going to be an increasing number of visits here. And actually, that actually happened because this was in 1980. And between the 80s and the 90s, the numbers of reports of abductions and medical experiments just exploded. So they also take fetuses, he was told. This is allegedly he was told. And that the government knows about that, the US and the UK governments, and they are trying to do damage control and shut these eyewitnesses up. So the government went on a program, allegedly, to discredit Colonel Howe, who was the guy in charge of the air base, because he wasn't having this. He was not about to cover up anything. I guess he wasn't in on it. And he started talking, and they did not like that. He says that they communicate telepathically because their brains are larger and they use more of them. He says we have the ability, but we don't develop it and we don't use it. They were there to take animal samples also to study. They can only time travel to the past, and they can only go 40 to 50,000 years back because they can't generate the necessary speed to go any farther, and they don't go into their future. And the United States government has gotten some downed UFOs from our future. That's what he was told. And the government actually believes that time travel is true. That they're not a military threat, but sometimes they do take people. They don't want to change their future. It's better for them to go back way, way far, and then there's less of an effect on their future. So I think it must have something to do with DNA development. So he has heard agents that are running through 5 possible scripts to give him while he's under, they're talking back and forth, and they have these 5 different stories, but it involves basically the same story, but with different dates. He's warned not to talk, that he'll get hurt. And also, he would do damage to national security, which would cause wars and social chaos. So 2 weeks later, Holt wrote to the RAF, the English guys, describing this whole event. And he had the wrong date. He said it happened on the 27th. So the big question here is that there's uncertainty about exactly when it happened. Did it happen late at night on the 25th, very early on the morning of the 26th, like shortly after midnight of the 25th, 26th? Or did it happen really on the 27th, or was there more than one event? So lights were spotted in the woods, and they thought, oh my God, maybe it's a plane crash, and they drove over, and 3 of them, this is according to Holt, he went with them. What I remember reading is they were having an employee Christmas party, day or 2 after Christmas, and these guards came in, shook, and he's like, okay, I've heard enough, because apparently there was another story a couple days previous, so I'm going to take care of this myself. So he gets in the Jeep and he goes into the woods with them. They drive up to the woods, and then they get out of their Jeep and they walk deeper into the woods, and they think, oh, we have a plane crash here. And they see this strange glowing metallic object pulsing red lights, and it has a bank of blue lights underneath it. And as they approach, it starts to move off, and all the animals on all the farms nearby are going crazy. And there's another redacted report that Howe has seen from someone to the Ministry of Defense. That's like the English Department of Defense, talking about small entities in pressure suits with no helmets, and they seemed to hover even on the ground. The beings themselves seemed to hover a little bit. They had a claw-like 3-digit hand with a thumb. And so her question is, what happened to Homo sapien evolution if this is future humans? So after September of 94, this session, Pennington said this, and I'm not 100% sure I'm going to read this. It depends on how long it is. Oh, it's nice and short. He says that he's trying to explain how you could travel into the past from the future and how fast you go. And he says, well, listen, Einstein used to talk about this. He had a limerick, and this is the limerick. There once was a lady named Bright who traveled much faster than light. She departed one day in a relative way and came home the previous night. I thought that was very clever. Oh, and I just show you very briefly, just for the purposes, all this, documentation from the Ministry of Defense, from the Department of the Air Force. Some of it's pretty redacted, but these are copies that she received. And the big fear is that the government is holding back because they're terrified that the aliens will retaliate if they actually get interference. So the idea of time travel was presented in another abduction case. The whole idea of traveling at the speed of light having been, discussed by Einstein. The paradox is that going back in time to bring genetic material forward is inherently changing the future. So, but then, looking at this with a more analytical eye, is the paradox merely the result of our three-dimensional world understanding, and we just lack the language and the understanding? Because after all, time has no meaning. Everything happens simultaneously. So does it change the future? I don't know. So then we have a book called Messages, The Sphinx by Graham Hancock and Robert Duvall. And they discuss time travel being an aspiration of the ancient Egyptians. And this is just ideas that Howe's throwing out here. So, it's not a new idea. Also, Pennington referred to interpreters having their DNA taken. And her question is this a bloodline with memory files encoded in the DNA? What's going on here? So a P3 bear trap U.S. Navy man and Grays, 1987 is the title of the next section. So this book is just one after another of stories. In 91, she got a call from a guy called Axel, a former U.S. Navy specialist in the 1980s who used high tech to listen to Soviet subs and to track them. And he flew in a thing called a P3 bear trap, so bear being the Soviet bear, and this is a specialized, specially equipped airplane. This is part of secret Cold War ops. Very sophisticated cryptography was used. It was part of the Walker spy case, he says. Walker gave P3 crypto codes to the Soviets. So, this is a real thing. This is not imaginary. Axel told of an event in 1987 with Grays that had big eyes. And he said that she met this guy, Axel, and another guy called Bill. They invited her to dinner, and they came up to her motel room because they got a separate hotel room, and she joined them there. And she said, I was thinking, God, I'd be worried about my safety. Two complete strangers with this sort of bizarre story. I wouldn't go in the car with them, but they went to a non-bugged hotel room. And at dinner, she said they were very nervous, but they told her they were nervous because they felt it was dangerous to talk to her. They warned her that Axel, the guy, one of the two guys, was so stressed that he often vomited talking about the subject. And they wouldn't let her record, but she could take notes. And he explained the technology of the P3, and it involved a time code generator, and if the clock stopped, the plane wouldn't fly. And he said in 1987, there was an event where he and a crew of 11 in a P3 were over ice and water, and the clock stopped. And the instruments all went haywire, but the plane kept flying smoothly. And they looked out the window, and he said there was nothing there. There were no clouds, there was no sky, there was no horizon, there was no water, there was no sound, just air. And a voice in his head, something telepathic, said, something to show you if you're interested. So he was rapidly shown a number of scenes of other realities, like somebody took a TV and changed the channels really, really fast. He said, I didn't move, but everything around me kept changing. My feet stayed on the air. So he's in the air. Not on the plane anymore. He's in the air, outside, this nothingness of air, feet resting on nothing, but he's not moving, and he's being shown this quick change of scenery. He said then three guys with large eyes, three gray guys with large eyes, like, he said, like glorified bellhops. They escorted him. At this point in the narrative, telling Howe about it in the restaurant, he had to excuse himself to go be sick. He returned and he said, hey, I'm sorry, the government messed with my brain. The ETs took him places. They showed him a dinosaur in a green fog, a field of gold flowers that his hand could pass through. They weren't solid. And then to a round room, and he said a guy like Sir Percival from the Round Table met him. He was blonde, about 5.5. He had green eyes. He was blonde, about 5 feet 1 or 2, in a robe. He told him that he was on a spiritual quest and received mystical revelations about God and man's struggle to evolve. Okay, who is this guy? The blonde man told me I have to give up something before I can do whatever I'm supposed to do. He is also being given this mission. He said all humans could be like him, like Sir Percival, as he calls him, if we aspired with pure hearts. Everyone has a chance to see what's wrong, what's right, and to choose the proper course of action. All humans are going to be judged very shortly. And the next thing you knew, he was back on the plane, the horizon, the clouds, the ice, the water, the sounds, everything normal. The flight crew members were screaming that 2 engines were on fire and had to be shut down. They proceeded to an emergency mode to the nearest base. And he says the last clear memory he had after landing was flipping off a toggle switch. And then he said, I don't remember the next month or so, completely missing from my life. So he started having flashbacks. He was honorably discharged. He tried to renew his enlistment and they wouldn't let him. They told him he was no longer eligible for any kind of government service ever again. He became bitter and angry about it. And every time he tried to recall something, he would vomit. But then in 1990, he began having memory flashbacks. The Greys had said that the purpose of life had to do with our souls. So now here's a very interesting juxtaposition. Now we're talking about weird defiance of the laws of physics. We're talking about time travel. We're talking about the sighting of UFOs, and the aliens, the alien beings, look nothing like us, are telling them, we're from your future and we're all here about spirituality. Whoa. So he was told that there's a finite number of souls. That's very important to know. And he drew a map for Howe of the United States and what it was supposed to look like in 93. In that map, southern Florida, the northeastern U.S., the Mississippi Valley, and all of California were underwater. And he said it was going to happen because of a sky fire and polar shifts. Yet 93 came and went, and the Gray Being's future map version did not occur, like so many other future visions in the abduction syndrome that have not materialized. This is allegedly, according to what he says, he was told that he reported to Howe. Not my words. I'm not saying any of this is true. So, where do we go here? Axel didn't like being challenged about all of this by Howe. She wanted proof, and he said that if he gave her proof, he would be a dead man. He said he'd seen her work, and he just needed to tell this to someone who would believe it. And then the meeting ended, and he began calling her about his memories. He asked to meet her at a truck stop. He drove a semi for a living, and he asked to meet her partway on a job at a truck stop because he said the conversation that they had at this restaurant was only the partial story. And so they met again on April 20th of 1992 at a truck stop so that he could tell her the real rest of the story. And I'm going to end here. It's a cliffhanger because I don't want to interrupt the story because of time. So this is the end of video number 3, and I'll be back with video number 4 in 1 second. Slongafoil.